Welcome, everyone. Welcome back. We resume our literary journey. Today, my mission is to close the Hardy class. We were so rudely interrupted, and we never did finish. And I would like to just give you some thoughts about the novel. As you can see, I've used my usual system. We're not going to be able to cover the book the way we usually do. We don't really have time. One of the things that we're doing today is making sure that my technology works. I can see as I'm looking at the screen that I have a very bad reflection on my glasses, and I'm not sure how to get rid of that. I'll have to call my daughter. So another thing just to remind you is we are going to continue in the fall. We're going to do Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, and we're starting in mid-September. I forgot to look up the date, so I'm sure you've seen the registration form Jane has sent out. So we'll see you then. The one mission of today is to make sure that I have the technology to make this work. So far it looks pretty good. As you can see, this is my lovely office. It isn't really. This whole camera thing is an illusion. This is actually in my back hallway. Not only that, I feel like a newscaster wearing shorts behind the desk, because indeed I am. We're going to start with some words from Virginia Woolf. There is a collection of essays written by authors like Virginia Woolf, and it's called Genius and Ink. She writes about Thomas Hardy's novels. She says, "When we say that the death of Thomas Hardy leaves the art of fiction in England without a head, as we are speaking the most obvious of truths. So long as Hardy lived, there was not a writer who did not feel that his calling was crowned by the unworldly and simple old man who made not the slightest effort to assert his sovereignty, yet stood for more to this generation than it is possible for any single voice to say." Virginia Woolf, of course, was a contemporary, and I thought this was interesting because this is what his peers thought. "The effect of such a presence is indeed incalculable," she goes on. "His greatness as a writer, his standing among the great of other ages, will be judged perhaps more truly by critics of a later day." That would be us. "But it is for the living to bear witness to another sort of influence, hardly less important, and though bound in the nature of things, more quickly to disappear. He was a spiritual force. He made it seem honorable to write, desirable to write with sincerity. So long as he lived, there was no excuse for thinking meanly of the art he practiced. His genius, his age, his distance might remove all possibility of intercourse. The plainness and the homeliness of his life lent him an obscurity which neither legend nor gossip disturbed. But it is no exaggeration to say that while he lived there was a king among us, and now we are without. Of no one, however, would it be more unfitting to write in terms of rhetorical eulogy. His only demand upon us, and there is none more exacting, was that we should speak the truth." That is the nugget of what Hardy is trying to do in his novels. He is trying to present to us a true picture of the Wessex area that he is trying to preserve and convey. If we go to where we left off, and I'm fairly certain it was chapter 27, and entitled "Hiving the Bees." And so, of course, I looked it up. Hiving the Bees. I thought this was one of those nuggets of detail that Hardy is so good at conveying. This little bit about the hiving the bees is modern day, but hiving the bees must have been similar, bees being what they are. This says, "Hiving a package of bees is not difficult, but to a beginner it can be intimidating. Most books on beekeeping have illustrated hiving instructions that you should study, but if you have not done that, Here, in brief, is how you can hive your package of bees. I didn't know they came in packages. Heat is the main enemy of package bees. If the weather is warm when you receive them, it is best to set the package in a cool place that is not brightly lit. The bees should be hanging from the top of the cage in a cluster around the feed can and should be quiet. And we notice in this chapter, right at the beginning, we are told that, let's see, Bathsheba was standing in her garden watching a swarm in the air and guessing their probable settling place. Not only were they late this year, but unruly. I guess bees were always bees. This author goes on to say, let's see, something about the sweetener. If there is as much as 1 inch of dead bees, notify the shipper. No, we don't need that. Before you hive them, the bees should be fed all the syrup made of half sugar and half warm water that they will take up, probably a pint. And in fact, the narrator goes on to tell us that they are a solid black spot upon the light at the bottom of the page. And over on the next page, Troy looked far away. I don't see why you want to bring her, he said coldly. An unconscious look of assent in Bathsheba's eyes betrayed that something more than his coldness had made her also feel that Liddy would be superfluous in the suggested scene. She had felt it, even whilst making the proposal. So I think that she's capitulating, of course, to Troy, as she began to do, which we think is probably a shame because she was so independent. But this little scene in the orchard with the bees, I thought was really a clear little bit about life at the time. In the next chapter, we see this sword display from Troy. He's flaunting his talent as a swordsman. Notice, though, in chapter 28, the backdrop in nature. He's got this sword that he's flashing around and snips off a bit of her hair. But down at the bottom of page, I don't know what page, 195, she waited 1 minute, 2 minutes, thought of Troy's disappointment at her non-fulfillment of a promised engagement, till she again ran along the field, clambered over the bank, and followed the original direction. She changed her mind, and yet meets up with him again. He says on page 196, "Now," said Troy, producing the sword, which, as he raised it into the sunlight, gleamed a sort of greeting, like a living thing. "First, we have 4 right and 4 left cuts, 4 right and 4 left thrusts. Infantry cuts and guards are more interesting than ours to mine, but they are not so swashing." So he's just making a big old scene of his skill with this sword. Down at the bottom of the page, she hurriedly interrupted, "I rather not, though I don't mind your 2s and 4s, but your 1s and 3s are terrible." And he replies, "Very well, I'll let you off the 1s and 3s. Now cuts, points, and guards together." He truly exhibited them. Then there's pursuing practice in this way. We know at the end of this novel, or actually in several more chapters, that he is going to resign his military position. So this all seems, speaking of Liddy being superfluous, he is too. At the bottom, how murderous and bloodthirsty. At the top of page 195, or 197, sorry. "You are my antagonist, with this difference from real warfare, that I shall miss you every time by 1 hair's breadth, or perhaps 2. He's dominating this scene, and he's borderline threatening her with these swashbuckling movements. Bathsheba's adventurous spirit was beginning to find some grays of relish in these highly novel proceedings. So they're standing in a beautiful area. If you look back over on page 196, second paragraph, the pit was a saucer-shaped concave, naturally formed, with a top diameter of about 30 feet and shallow enough to allow the sunshine to reach their heads. Standing in the center, the sky overhead was met by a circular horizon of fern. This grew nearly to the bottom of the slope, and then abruptly ceased. The middle, within the belt of verdure, was floored with a thick, flossy carpet of moss and grass intermingled, so yielding that the foot was half buried within it. This is some of the references that that Virginia Woolf was making, this beautiful nature. And then we've got this scene where there's some tension between Troy and Bathsheba. At the end of the paragraph, the right middle of page on 197, all was quick as electricity. You can hear it going swoosh, swoosh. Over on the next page, in short, she was enclosed in a firmament of light and sharp hisses, resembling a skyfall of meteors close at hand. Never since the broadsword became the national weapon had there been more dexterity shown in its management than the hands of Sergeant Troy, and never had he been in such splendid temper for the performance as now in the evening sunshine along the ferns with Bathsheba. Just a really interesting contrast between the backdrop of nature and this display. So that over on page 199, is that what that is? 199, yes. He says, the caterpillar was spitted upon its point. Why, it is magic. So he's so good that he can stab a caterpillar. And she's kind of amazed. We are told she's amazed. And he says, that was to get you to stand still, so make sure of your safety. The risk of injuring you through your moving was too great not to force me to tell you a fib to escape it. So this was, there is kind of a tension here between this swashbuckler and his sword. A number of critics have made a big deal about this scene because it is a kind of phallic symbol, the sword itself is, and he is demonstrating his prowess and his masculinity. Over in the next chapter, I want to read something else by Virginia Woolf. Our task then, as this is Virginia Woolf again, as we consider the 17 volumes of fiction which he has left us, is not to attempt to grade them in order of merit or to assign them to their final station in English literature. Rather, we must try to discover the broad outlines of his genius, to distinguish between those qualities which are and those which are not still forces in the life of the present moment, to content ourselves with conjectures rather than attempt the more exact and measured estimate which time will bring within our reach. She goes on to talk about the novel itself, which apparently I didn't mark. I'll find it. Oh yeah, here we are. For these reasons, Hardy's genius was uncertain in development, uneven in accomplishment, but when the moment came, magnificent in achievement, the moment came completely and fully in far from the madding crowd. The subject was right, the method was right, the poet and the countryman, the sensual man and the somber reflective man, the man of learning, all enlisted to produce a book which, however fashions may chop and change, must remain one of the great English novels. There is, and this is from Virginia Woolf, who writes great novels, there is, in the first place, that sense of the physical world which Hardy more than any novelist can bring before us, like the scene in the backdrop with the sword, the sense that the little prospect of man's existence is ringed by a landscape which, while it exists apart, yet confers a deep and solemn beauty upon his drama. We'll come back to more of that. In the next chapter, Bathsheba is beginning to be smitten by Troy, and we're thinking to ourselves, oh, please. But she's smitten. I have an article. This is an article by Linda M. Shires, and it's entitled Narrative, Gender, and Power in Far from the Madding Crowd. And Troy truly is wielding his power. When we get to chapter, this is 29, I think I'm ahead of myself. Oh no. From its publication, Far from the Madding Crowd generated, like other novels by Hardy, a paper trail on gender, sex, and power. But more than others, it encouraged comment and confusion about gender, both that of its author and that of its hero and heroine. Gabriel Oak and Bathsheba Everdeen. When Far from the Madding Crowd appeared anonymously in the Cornhill magazine, the Spectator review of January 3, 1874, insisted that Harvey's serial must have been written by a woman, none other than George Eliot of Adam Bede. Such a mistake fascinates, but is utter rightness and wrongness, for the reviewer accurately picks up the gender blurring of the text, but attributes to a woman with a man's name who has written a patriarchal pastoral. In so doing, he mistakes the situation of the novel's authoring for the very topic of the novel. Hardy, however, has taken immense pains to write a non-patriarchal pastoral. So seduced is he by his own love for the unaggressive feminine, which he does not limit to one sex. To Henry James, this is Bathsheba, she was inconsequential, willful, and meddlesome, unable to be understood or liked. The reviewer of The Observer was even more critical, citing her lack of modesty and expressing sorrow that Gabriel Oak was not sufficiently manly to refuse to have anything more to say to such an incorrigible hussy. That's Bathsheba. So in this chapter 29, we now see the element of folly distinctly mingling with the many varying particulars which made up the character of Bathsheba Everdeen. So I think that article really hits the point on the head that that Hardy is blurring those gender lines. A couple of lines later, Bathsheba, though she had too much understanding to be entirely governed by her womanliness, had too much womanliness to use her understanding to the best advantage. Perhaps in no minor point does woman astonish her helpmate more than in the strange power she possesses of believing cajoleries that she knows to be false. Bathsheba loved Troy in a way that only self-reliant women love when they abandon their self-reliance. And that is what Troy does to her. When a strong woman recklessly throws away her strength, she is worse than a weak woman who has never had any strength to throw away. One source of her inadequacy is the novelty of the occasion. She has never had practice in making the best of such a condition. Weakness is doubly weak by being new. So Bathsheba has, and we've seen this through the whole novel, has been completely independent. And now she's got this guy coming around, and we are going to find out a bit about his personality. And she's taken with him. She's taken. If we look on the next page, her love was entire as a child's, and though warm as summer, it was fresh as spring. Notice the yearly cycle language. Her capability lay in her making no attempt to control feeling by subtle and careful inquiry into its consequences. In other words, she's never felt like this. She liked Oak, but she wasn't in love with him. And she eventually, she will see that she isn't all that interested in Boldwood either. All this infatuation Gabriel saw. Remember, throughout the novel, Oak, who's as strong as an oak tree, remains completely steady and doesn't throw himself at her, but doesn't perish at the thought of losing her. If we fly on over to, if we go over to page 212, we see at the bottom of the page, "No, Liddy, you must stay," says Bathsheba, dropping from her haughtiness to entreaty with capricious inconsequence. "You must not notice my being my being in a taking just now. You are not as a servant, you are a companion to me. There's an interesting relationship there between Liddy, the servant, and her boss. There's really, in this novel, also an investigation of female friendship. And they have it there. It goes up and down. It's even sometimes, and sometimes it's master-servant type thing. But at the bottom of this page, it says, I wonder sometimes if I am doomed to die in the Union. The Union was a workhouse, and this is where people went, of course, you knew this, to when they were out of work. And I looked this up, of course, because I was curious. I know what a workhouse is because we've all read Dickens, and Dickens presents to us many examples. But I looked it up, and later on I'll read this because I have a note to myself, don't read this until chapter 39, so I won't. But I do have something here about page 133. As you can see, I spent a good deal of yesterday doing the same thing I always do with my papers and articles. This novel, this chapter is entitled "The Patriarchy of Class." The scenes of shared labor, and this is also the bee-hiving chapter. The scenes of shared labor, crucial to the representation of fulfilled love between Gabriel Oak and Bathsheba Everdeen, and of the thwarted love of Marty South. Well, that's a different novel. Bathsheba's fear that her social and economic power may have made her mannish is answered decisively but unexpectedly in Liddy's positing of gender convergence rather than polarity. She says this at the end of page 213. Liddy says, Bathsheba says first, I hope I am not a bold sort of maid, mannish, she continued with some anxiety. I'm sure you remember in our short story class, the one about the women, that women did fear that as they got more and more rights, so did men actually, that everybody was fearing that with this gender blurring, with giving women rights at the end of the 1800s, was going to blur those gender lines to such a degree that women were going to become mannish. And Liddy says, oh no, not mannish, but so almighty womanish that 'tis getting on that way sometimes. Ah, miss, she said, after having drawn her breath very sadly in and sent it out very sadly, I wish I had half your failing that way. 'Tis a great protection to a poor maid in these illegitimate days. So he's brought in this crumb that we have seen in other situations about this fear that women had. And of course, Bathsheba is running this farm, and not only running it, but doing it well. Although the representation of class and gender differences and alliances is not confined to the heterosexual love relationship, it is there that Hardy locates their pains and pleasures at their sharpest. Difference itself is often powerfully erotically charged. There is, I think, some fetishistic about Hardy's textualization of sexuality, and it is often expressed in a slightly disturbing way through the disembodied gender significance of clothes. The scene in which the gazes of the members, no, that's a different book. Here's the bit about the female friendship. Where gender is concerned, matter appears rather different, though there is little of female friendship in the novels. Both Far from the Madding Crowd and The Woodlanders contain important moments in which a recognition of commonality of experience between women overcomes the way in which their own emotional interests play them at odds. In the first, Bathsheba takes responsibility for Fanny's burial and grave initially because it is her role as employer, but then out of fellow feeling, while at the, and then that's the other novel. The effect is to heighten the sense of isolation on which these characters live out their common dilemmas. So we'll see this subsequently. Usually when I'm doing this class, I try not to give away the end of the novel, but I'm pretty sure by now you would know what has happened. And we will see that friendship, that willingness to be something to help Fanny, even though Fanny's dead and in the grave. We'll see that Bathsheba will write some additional words on her gravestone, even though Fanny was the one that Troy was in love with. If we look over on page, oh, I already said that. So there's another point here. This absence of mothers also throws into sharper relief, at least in the cases of Fanny. What else did I have to read on that one? I don't think so. So we have Boldwood in the next chapter, who's beginning to remember, he was dignified, and everybody admired him, and he was considered to be a great catch, but he was not he was not to be caught. And then in the next chapter, Blame and Fury, he's not too dignified to be passionate. So that's at the bottom of this page, on page 214, we see Nature in Bloom, another interesting passage about nature. I don't have enough room here. So, leaving her instructions with Gabriel and Marianne that they were to see everything carefully locked up for the night, she went out of the house just at the close of a timely thunder shower, which had refined the air and daintily bathed the coat of the land, though all beneath was dry as ever. Freshness was exhaled in the essence from the varied contours of bank and hollow, as if the earth breathed maiden breath. You can see how he was so enamored with this area that is far from the madding crowd. He goes on, as if the earth breathed maiden breath, and the pleased birds were hymning to the scene. Before her, among the clouds, there was a contrast in the shape of layers of fierce light, which showed themselves in the neighborhood of hidden sun, lingering on the farthest northwest corner of the heavens that midsummer season allowed. In the next chapter, he goes on to remind us of the daily cycle. So we have daily cycles, then we have the seasonal cycles, we have life cycles, and it's all enmeshed. She had walked nearly 2 miles of her journey, watching how the day was retreating, and thinking how the time of deeds was quietly melting into the time of thought, to give place in its turn to the time of prayer and sleep. Boldwood was stepping on, not with that quiet tread of reserved strength which was his customary gait, in which he always seemed to be balancing two thoughts. His manner was stunned and sluggish now. Boldwood had for the first time been awakened to a woman's privileges in the tergiversation that I know that means equivocation, even when it involves another person's possible light. He's never been in love with anybody before, and he's really taken with her. That Bathsheba was a firm and positive girl, far less inconsequent than her fellows, had been the very lung of his hope. We go on, down at the bottom of this page, there are accents in the eye which are not on the tongue, and more tales come from the pale lips than can enter an ear. It is both the grandeur and pain of the remoter moods that they avoid the pathway of sound. Boldwood's look was unanswerable. So he had been completely passive, and then is beginning to reveal his emotion even on his face. So what else can I tell you that is the next chapter is 32. Here we have Oak's experience, and notice how we get Troy, then we get Boldwood, and then we get Oak. The village of Weatherbury was quiet as the graveyard in its midst, and the living were lying well nigh as still on the dead. This is an interesting observation, because at the end of the 1800s, there was beginning to be a trend in turning graveyards into park-like settings. So if you think about our graveyards now, the newer ones, they are established as park-like settings. This is part of the romanticism of the era, that one would go to a graveyard to be contemplative. In fact, you might even bring your children there, because then they might experience the park-like setting. And children were on the cusp between, we know this, between having been born and turning into adults and then having died. And so somehow there was this connection between contemplation and the park-like setting of the grave. And we have it right here. Look at this image. The church clock struck 11. The air was so empty of other sounds that the whir of the clockwork immediately before the strokes was distinct, and so was also the click of the same at their close. That's a very quiet setting. Let's see what else. Where do we have it here? Over at the end of this chapter, her plan was now to drive to Bath during the night, see Sergeant Troy in the morning before he set out to come to her, bid him farewell and dismiss him, then to rest the horse thoroughly, herself to weep the while, she thought. It's a romantic picture. Starting early the next morning on her return journey. By this arrangement she could trot dainty gently all the way, reach Liddy at Yalbury in the evening, and come home to Weatherbury with her whenever they chose. So nobody would know that she had been to Bath at all. She was sneaking off to see Troy. Such was Bathsheba's scheme. But in her topographical ignorance, as a late-comer to the place, she misreckoned the distance of her journey as not much more than half of what it really was. Her idea, however, she proceeded to carry out with what initial success we have already seen. So she has miscalculated. She had gone to Bath, but it took her forever to get there. Oak and Coggan decide thereby that she's erratic. She's running off to Bath, running back. She's not making any sense. Over on page 230, Bathsheba's perturbed meditations by the roadside had ultimately evolved a conclusion that there were only two remedies for the present desperate state of affairs. The first was merely to keep Troy away from Weatherbury till Boldwood's indignation had cooled. Remember that Boldwood said, "You will be punished." The second, to listen to Oak's entreaties and Boldwood's denunciations and give up Troy altogether. Well, of course, she doesn't do that. Chapter 33 is a entertaining one. We see quite a lot of the local dialect, the hominess, the religious references. There's humor and local color. Again, Hardy has so carefully created this picture for us. If we go in, and just note that this is a really beautiful picture of the local color. I can see that I get so taken with these novels. I have quite a lot to go. Chapter 34, Troy is beginning to develop into a character with some meanness. We saw that picture with him swashbuckling the sword and then lopping off one of her curls, I thought was aggressive. I mean, I'm sure that's what it was supposed to be. At the top of page 244, here we see a little bit of insight into Bathsheba's scheme to get rid of Troy. Or actually, it's Boldwood's scheme to get rid of Troy. "I'll pay you well now. I'll settle a sum of money upon her, and I'll see that you don't suffer from poverty in the future." He's going to pay to get rid of Troy. I'll put it clearly, Bathsheba is only playing with you. You are too poor for her, as I said. So give up wasting your time about a great match you'll never make for a moderate and rightful match you may make tomorrow. So he's offering Troy money to go away. And I'm sure you remember this. Later on in the novel, there were several references, at least two that I can recall, of Troy using Bathsheba's money. He has no money. And in fact, when he goes to pay for Fanny's gravestone, he collects money from Bathsheba, and then I think it was £7 that it was all the money he had to his name. So he's a little bit parasitic. In making this statement, Boldwood's voice revealed only too clearly a consciousness of the weakness of his position, his aims, and his method. His manner had lapsed quite from that of a firm and dignified Boldwood of former times, all because of his infatuation with Bathsheba. You're going to see later on in the novel that he begins to kind of lose it. He's so frantic about her. Page 249, there's a little inset that announces the marriage of Francis Troy, only son of the late Edward Troy, Esquire, M.D. of Weatherbury, and Sergeant 11th Dragoon Guards, to Bathsheba, only surviving daughter of the late Mr. John Everdeen of Casterbridge. I thought that was interesting, in that she's Bathsheba, daughter of Everdeen. I'm sure that this would have been the way things were established, but she doesn't even have her last name in here. I'm sure it's a sign of the times, because it was the end of the 1800s. Oops. 1 minute, drop my book. Sorry. As I said, there's something, quite the illusion here. So here is a point from this is Cambridge, the patriarchy of class. The proximity of love relationships and economic relations, debt, dependency, and possession in the novel draws attention to its conception of gender relations as suffused by distributions and inequalities of power. For a novel which is certainly on one level among the great literary romances, Far from the Madding Crowd is also curiously, strikingly full of episodes of malice, both human and otherwise. Probably the most obvious and extreme instance comes in Troy's torturing of Boldwood by delaying the news of his marriage in a way that impels his rival to offer him higher and higher bribes. But there are other such moments too, great and small. Bathsheba's sacking of Oak, that was early on. His refusal in return to save her sheep until she begs. Troy's repudiation of Bathsheba over the coffin of Fanny Robin. He finally admits that he really loved her. The gargoyle's destruction of his dilettantish efforts at atonement. Even the man at the workhouse's stoning of the dog that has assisted Fanny along the Casterbridge highway. When Fanny was making her way to the workhouse, of course, she fashioned some crutches and then still needed assistance, and a big dog comes out of the woods to help her. Of course, as a really big dog fan, I was kind of taken by that. It's kind of a rule of thumb that if there's a dog that is behaving well in a novel or a bit of fiction, sometimes it doesn't fare very well in the end. Perhaps as I'm teaching this class, you will see my big dog's big tail go by. She's got a big fuzzy black tail. But I noticed that particular bit because the dog comes out of the woods to save Fanny and take her to the workhouse. In the next chapter, so the summary of the last chapter was that Boldwood was infatuated and Troy was in the position to be contemptuous, and he takes advantage of it. The next chapter contrasts the varying characters. Chapter 36. This is the wedding ceremony, the party. It's the wedding reception. And the characters are in nature. They are in this beautiful environment. The night but it has a sinister aspect. A heated breeze from the south slowly fanned the summits of lofty objects, and in the sky dashes of buoyant cloud were sailing in a course at right angles, so that of another stratum, neither of them in the direction of the breezes below. This this wedding reception shows all these characters turns into their worst aspect, because we see a beginning of a shift in power. Troy now finds himself married to Bathsheba, and given the rules of the day, he now has a superior position. Down at the bottom of this page, I'm on page 256. Thunder was imminent, and taking some secondary appearances into consideration, it was likely to be followed by one of the lengthened rains which marked the close of dry weather for the season. Note again, the season. Things are changing. We go, let's see. Bathsheba indignantly left the barn, followed by all the women and children. Troy has ordered the women away from the wedding reception, never mind that it's Bathsheba's hosting it, and Troy gets out the liquor. Gabriel has left this revelry. He proceeds towards home. In approaching the door, his toe kicked something which felt and sounded soft, leathery, and distended like a boxing glove. It was a large toad. I love this picture. Humbly traveling across the path. Oak took it up, thinking it might be better to kill the creature to save it from pain, but finding it uninjured, he placed it again among the grass. He knew what his direct message from the Great Mother meant, and soon came another. So he's getting messages. Not really. He's taking knowledge from nature. Next paragraph. Oak's eyes followed the serpentine sheen to the other side, where it led to a huge brown garden slug, which had come indoors tonight for reasons of its own. It was nature's second way of hinting to him that he was to prepare for foul weather. So it's an omen. It's a warning that the weather is turning, and he is able to listen to the signals presented by nature. Certainly Troy wouldn't. All he wants is to get everybody drunk. If we fly to page 264, next came the barley. It was only possible to protect by systematic thatching. Time went on and the moon vanished. So this huge storm comes along, and they have, they meaning Bathsheba and Oak the bailiff, they have the ricks, which are piles of corn or barley, and they're stacked neatly and in an organized way, but they're out in the yard, and if they're not covered, they're going to get wet. And I'm sure you know what happens when, if you're cutting the lawn and the lawn gets wet, it clumps up and gets yucky and sticky. And same thing happens with corn and barley and all of these other crops. At the bottom, they will rot, and the crop will be lost. Here we have what an interesting contrast between Troy, who's getting all the locals drunk at the wedding reception, and Oak is out in the yard trying to protect the crops. Always steady as she goes. The next chapter, the storm, the two together. This is a point, again, that this chapter makes, is that when they are working together, they are making progress forward. This chapter goes on. The detailed working life in the novel, considerable as it is also accompanied by the detail of work refused, wasted, or neglected. Troy. To some extent, the early Bathsheba and Oak share the same carelessness. She wishes she could afford to pay a man to do the work for her, and he dozes off to sleep and loses his sheep when they were young and immature. They help to educate one another into responsible workers and landowners, with money-saving interventions as the currency of their romance. So they work together in order to cover cover the crops so that they're not so that the crops aren't ruined. This chapter has it's the storm, but if you recollect, the lightning flashes, and when it does, it briefly, momentarily illuminates. A rumble filled the air, seconding the approaching storm. So a light flapped over the sky as if reflected from the phosphorescent wings crossing the sky. The second peal. There came a third flash. The lightning now was the color of silver and gleamed in the heavens like a mailed army. Rumbles became rattles. Gabriel, from his elevated position, could see over the landscape at least half a dozen miles in front. So, flash and illumination. At the bottom of this page, then the picture vanished, leaving the darkness so intense that Gabriel worked entirely by feeling with his hands. Again, he's immersed in his work. There's a fifth flash. There's a sixth flash. It was not very dark when the lightning has been gone a bit. Here's Gabriel and Bathsheba working together. The next flare came. Bathsheba was on the ground now, shouldering another sheaf, and she bore its dazzle without flinching. Thunder and awe, and again ascended with the load. She's climbing up on a ladder, carrying a big old bit of tied, what is this one? It's a tied sheath of whatever it was in there. I think it was corn. The heavens opened up on the next page. So I think this is a really nice example of this concept of work in the novel and how it becomes their currency. Over on page 269, Gabriel, you are kinder than I deserved. I will stay and help you yet. Oh, why are not some of the others here? Oh, I know it all, she said, adding slowly, they are all asleep in the barn, in a drunken sleep, and my husband among them. That's it, is it not? Don't think I'm a timid woman and can't endure things. I am not certain, said Gabriel. I will go and see. Remember, he left, responsibly, of course. Next chapter is 38. We have the three suitors and their characteristics revealed. It's an interesting one. Oak slaved away again at the barley. This is mid-page 273. Over on 274, the gnarled shapes passed into the villages, Troy, their leader, entering the farmhouse. Not a single one of them had turned his face to the ricks, including Troy. And 275. Nor the little one by the stile. I overlooked the ricks this year. That's Boldwood. Even he is neglecting his ricks, his crops. And he's one of the wealthier townspeople. Then down a little bit further, a few months earlier, Boldwood's forgetting his husbandry would have been as preposterous an idea as a sailor forgetting he was in a ship. Oak was just thinking that whatever he himself might have suffered from Bathsheba's marriage, here was a man who had suffered more. When Boldwood spoke in a changed voice, that of one of who yearned to make a confidence and relieve his heart by an outpouring. So Oak is sympathetic here. Even though Boldwood also has a hankering for Bathsheba, he can see that it's beginning to affect his sanity. Chapter 39 is, 39. So, another revelation of Troy's character, we find that he's been gambling with Bathsheba's money, of course. This man was her husband, formerly Sergeant Troy, who, having bought his discharge with Bathsheba's money, was gradually transforming himself into a farmer of a spirited and very modern school. So he's really kind of enjoying the wealth that is at his hands. But somewhere on the next page, he says she accuses him of gambling with that money, which he has. But what we really see is Fanny in this chapter. 280. How on earth did you come here? I thought you were miles away or dead. Why didn't you write to me, said Troy to the woman in a strangely gentle yet hurried voice as he lifted her up. So she's laying on the side of the road because she is ill and exhausted and poor and pregnant. And we find out towards the bottom of 280, this indeed is Fanny. This is a revelation of Troy's character. He has married Bathsheba for her money, and still we think he still may have a love for Fanny. And Bathsheba notes that and then asks, do you know her name? And he lies. Again, a characteristic of Troy. So here's my little article about workhouses. So I looked it up, and there used to be one in Kensington, London. I don't know if you can see that picture. Oops, not good at focusing this. That picture, that's Kensington, London, and it looks remarkably like the college I attended in Kensington, London. It was called Kensington College. I couldn't find it anywhere said that Kensington College used to be a workhouse, but this article was very interesting about the governance of workhouses. They were designed with only a single entrance guarded by a porter, and we're going to see that, through which inmates and visitors alike had to pass. Near to the entrance were the casual wards for tramps and vagrants, and the relieving rooms where paupers were housed until they had been examined by a medical officer. After being assessed, the paupers were separated and allocated to the appropriate ward for their category: boys under 14, able-bodied men between 14 and 60, men over 60, girls under 14, able-bodied women between 14 and 60, and women over 60. Children under the age of 2 were allowed to remain with their mothers, but by entering a workhouse, paupers were considered to have forfeited responsibility for their families. Clothing and personal possessions were taken from them and stored, to be returned at their discharge. After bathing, they were issued a distinctive uniform. For men, it might be a striped cotton shirt, jacket, and trousers, and a cloth cap, and for women, a blue and white striped dress worn underneath a smock. The striped outfits sound remarkably like prison clothing. The people in my jail wear orange, but they all wear orange, men and women. Everybody looks the same. Shoes were also provided. In some establishments, certain categories of inmate were marked out by their clothing. For example, at Bristol Incorporation Workhouse, prostitutes were required to wear a yellow dress, and pregnant single women a red dress. Sounds like scarlet letter. Such practices were deprecated by the Poor Law Commission in a directive issued in 1839 entitled Dress for Unchaste Women in the Itch Ward. Oh, in workhouses, sorry. But they continued until at least 1866. Some workhouses had a separate foul or itch ward, where inmates diagnosed with skin diseases such as scabies could be detained before entering the workhouse proper. I thought this was very interesting because right now I am working back at the jail, but very, very, very few people are allowed to even come into the jail. Just I am allowed, and my co-teacher is allowed. They're not even allowing any lawyers in. But when they bring in a new prisoner, that prisoner is quarantined for at least 2 weeks. They're stuck in a cell by themselves, often one of the dorms, and that's how the authorities are keeping the COVID out of it. But I thought this was an interesting parallel. Also, not to be overlooked were destitute, unfortunate sufferers of mental health disorders who would be ordered to enter the workhouse by parish doctors. The patients afflicted with all forms of mental illness. The Poor Law and Lunacy Reform Act of 1853 did promote the asylum as the institution of choice for patients afflicted with all forms of mental illness. However, in reality, destitute people suffering from mental illness would be housed in their local workhouses. An interesting blurring of inmates. We saw that decades later as well. That people who were defined as insane were often housed in prisons. Okay, so we're just going to skip a few chapters on. I don't need to summarize the plot for you. There is in chapter 41, I believe this is Roman numerals. There's trouble in paradise between Bathsheba and Troy. And if we move on to the end of that chapter on page 299, Liddy often speaks the villagers' minds. She says on 299, towards the bottom, "One day I just named it to him and asked him if he knew Fanny's young man. He said, oh yes, he knew the young man as well as he knew himself." This is Troy. And that wasn't a man in the regiment he liked better. Of course, it was himself he's describing. Said that, did he? Yes, and he said that there was a strong likeness between himself and the other young man, so that sometimes people mistook them. Liddy, for heaven's sake, stop your talking, said Bathsheba, with a nervous petulance that comes from worrying perceptions. Yeah, Bathsheba understands. So if we go to chapter, the next, 42. Fanny's dead. And nobody seems to be making much of a big deal about it, as if to suggest that this was just another extension of the life cycle. Fanny's dead. She's taken her baby with her, of course, and it's life. It's just the process of life. Let's see, page 304, back to Weatherbury. I got poor little Fanny Robin in my wagon outside. Notice that her last name is Robin. It's a little tiny bird. And if we go on over to Under the Tree reaction, this is 44, page 323. I have some other pieces in this article by Linda Shires. Where did that go? That's Bridget. Oh, here it is. Linda Shires goes on to say that gender and power are not permanently aligned in Far from the Madding Crowd. While prior feminist readings align power with the male and victimization with the female, and thus the cultural construction of gender with biology, I will argue for Hardy's representations of gender as subtle, mobile, and heterogeneous. That's what we see in this discussion of Fanny. Troy gave her over because she went to the wrong church for the wedding, for their scheduled wedding, and now we can see that he's still in love with her, but he, excuse me, he has the power in that relationship. It is something that he has taken on in his relationship with Bathsheba as well. He attempts to dominate her. I think that's all I was going to read in this article. I think so. So Bathsheba is in a very dark place, physically and emotionally. She has walked out in the night, and she sleeps in this ditch. And in this first paragraph, on looking into the place, it occurred to her that she had seen it by daylight on some previous occasion, and that what appeared like an impassable thicket was in reality a brake of fern now withering fast. She could think of nothing better to do with her palpitating self than go in here and hide. And entering, she lighted on a spot sheltered from the damp fog by a reclining trunk, where she sank down upon a tangled couch of fronds and stems. She mechanically pulled some armfuls around her to keep off the breezes, and closed her eyes. I'm pretty sure that those must have been, what are those called? I have these huge ferns in my backyard. Peacock ferns, ostrich ferns, that's what they are. They are probably 4 feet, 5 feet tall. So she goes into this little, essentially a rabbit hole, and it's damp and cold, but it's a kind of rebirth for her. And of course that symbolism is all through this. I can't find it. But anyway, this this dissension into some place that's damp and cold, and then she comes out on the other side, having been reborn or having rethought her situation. If we look towards the end of this chapter, the sun went down almost blood red that night, and a livid cloud received its rays in the east. Up against this dark background, the west front of the church tower, the only part of the edifice visible from the farmhouse windows, rose distinct and lustrous, the vane upon the summit bristling with rays. Hereabouts at 6 o'clock, the young men of the village gathered, as was their custom, for a game of prisoner's base. It's a card game. The spot had been consecrated to this ancient diversion from time immemorial, the old stocks conveniently forming a base facing the boundary of the churchyard, in front of which the ground was trodden hard and bared as a pavement by the players. She could see the brown and black heads of the young lads darting about right and left, their white shirt sleeves gleaming in the sun, whilst occasionally a shout and a peal of hearty laughter varied the stillness of the evening air. They continued playing for a quarter of an hour, when the game concluded abruptly and the players leapt over the wall and vanished round to the other side beside a yew tree, which was also half beyond a beech. Another echo of this concept of the churchyard and the graveyard, because they were always connected, being a place of contemplation and a place where children can play and be part of nature. There's some more insight into Troy in the next chapter on the bottom of page 332. As soon as it grew light enough to distinguish objects, Troy arose from the coverlet of the bed, in a mood of absolute indifference to Bathsheba's whereabouts. She's still outside, and almost oblivious to her existence. He stalked downstairs and left the house by the back door. If we go over to, let's see. Here's where he takes the 27 pounds. I forgot to look how much that was at the time. And buys, over on page 333, he asks for a good tomb. Here's a marble headstone, beautifully crocketed, which is carved, with medallions beneath the typical subjects. Here's the footstone after the same pattern, and here's the coping to enclose the grave. The polishing alone of the set cost me 11 pounds. The slabs are the best of their kind, and I can warrant them to resist rain and frost for 100 years without flying. And then over on the next page, he goes to the gravesite and digs the tomb, which is the only time that we ever see Troy doing anything of resembling work. But we sort of feel sorry for him. Troy, in his this is over on 335, in his prostration at this time, had no perception that in the futility of these romantic doings, dictated by a remorseful reaction from previous indifference, there was an element of absurdity. Deriving his idiosyncrasies from both sides of the channel, he showed at such junctures as the present inelasticity of the Englishman, together with that blindness to the line where sentiment verges on the mawkishness characteristic of the French. Just a little shot at the French for being a little bit too emotional. But in some ways that's true of Troy. He was cold and indifferent to Fanny when he threw her over at the wedding, and yet now he's sorry, but it's too late to be sorry. So there's really no risk to him. Let's see. I want to go to page 383. This is an important chapter. Things are beginning, the storylines are beginning to mesh. Hardy has so many things in his novel, and the storylines weren't necessarily crossing until we get to this chapter. It says converging courses, and there's it's Christmas Eve. Of course, it's the birth of Christ. There's 7 sections. This is the only chapter that is divided into sections. The biblical importance of 7 is that the world was created in 7 days. So the new order is going to be created in these 7 sections. There's 7 days in a week. Also, there's the unity of the 4 corners plus the Trinity, which again is 7. So this chapter, we're going to see a convergence of all of the elements. This is a party that Boldwood is going to throw, but we see that he is beginning to become unglued. The first section is about the party. It's Christmas Eve. The second section is about Bathsheba and her beginning to waver. She's talking to Liddy, and remember that Liddy often acts as the voice of the villagers. No, Liddy, I have never been free from trouble since I have lived here, and this party is likely to bring me more. Now, fetch my black silk dress and see how it sits upon me. Here's their relationship again. There's master and servant, but mistress and servant, I suppose. But you will leave off that surely, ma'am. You have been a widow lady 14 months, and ought to brighten up a little on such a night as this. Is it necessary? Bathsheba responds. No, I will appear as usual, for if I were to wear any light dress, people would say things about me, and I should seem to be rejoicing when I am sullen all the time. Solemn. The party doesn't suit me a bit, but never mind, stay and help to finish me off. The third chapter section is Boldwood, who's weirdly confident of his chances. He thinks that because Bathsheba's husband is now dead, that's Troy, remember they're calling her Mrs. Troy, that he has a chance, and she says probably not for a long time. And so he is weirdly confident that she's going to let her guard down. And if we look to section 4, this is about Troy. He's reappeared. He sure has. He has reappeared, and he's wearing a disguise, a big coat with a collar I envision to be up that high. Next chapter, section 5, is we meet with Bathsheba. How do I look tonight, Liddy? Said Bathsheba, giving a final adjustment to her dress before leaving the glass. I never saw you look so well before. Yes, I'll tell you when you looked like it. That night a year and a half ago, when you came in so wild-like and scolded us for making remarks about you and Mr. Troy. The whole town, of course, was all gossipy. Top of 390, we see her wavering. No, marrying for me yet for many a year. If ever, 'twill be for reasons very, very different from those you think, or others will believe. Now get my cloak, for it is time to go. A reference again to the fact that she and Oak have a history in work, not in infatuation, which is what she felt for Troy. And chapter 6, section 6 is, we see poor Oak. He's been thrown over again. We see, it opens with Boldwood. Before you go, I want to mention what has been passing in my mind lately. And what has been passing in his mind lately is that he's going to marry Bathsheba. Then if I marry her, and I feel I shall. So there, he's very confident. And she has not given him anything to be confident. about. At the end of this section, on 391, a reserved and somber expression had returned to Boldwood's face again, but it poorly cloaked his feelings when he pronounced Bathsheba's name, and his feverish anxiety continued to show its existence by a galloping motion of his fingers upon the side of his thigh as he went down the stairs. Then section 7, it begins with Troy. How does this cover me, Pennyways? You remember who Pennyways was? That was the bailiff that Bathsheba fired for stealing from her. So interesting that that's who Troy has been taking up with. He's in a disguise. Pennyways now felt himself on page 393. Oh, wait a minute. Yes, I expect I shall not be a very welcome guest if he has her there, said Sergeant with a slight laugh, a sort of Alonzo the Brave. And this is a character who appeared out of nowhere. And when I go in, the guests will sit in silence and fear, and all laughter and pleasure will be hushed. And that's in fact what does happen. And the lights in the chamber turn blue, and the worms, ugh, horrible, ring for some more brandy. Pennyways, I felt an awful shudder just then. That's a premonition of what in fact is going to happen. So the next moment it tells you that this is another consequence of what's going to happen. Here's the townsmen all talking about having seen Troy in town. And the townspeople are like the chorus in Shakespeare. They speak what's going on. If he's alive and here in the neighborhood, he means mischief, said the first. Down at the bottom, what a fool she must have been ever to have anything to do with the man. She's so self-willed and independent, too, that one is more minded to say it serves her right than pity her. That's speaking the truth. Over on page 396, Boldwood is getting more fanatical. I hope to God she'll come, or this night will be nourished in nothing but misery to me. Oh, my darling, why do you keep me in suspense like that? She hasn't let him on at all, and he's getting more and more frantic. Over on 397, oh, 'tis enough, Faith. I cannot understand Farmer Boldwood being such a fool at his time of life as to hoe and hanker after that woman. He's smitten. We know that. That's local language. Over on page 399, I've been trying to get an opportunity of speaking to you, said Boldwood. You know perhaps what I long to say. And what he longs to say is that he wants her to commit to marrying him in even 5 years. Top of 400. Please marry me at the end of 5 3/4. You owe it to me. Well, she kind of falls for that because she left him off pretty brutally, and so now he's saying, well, then you owe me. And she feels guilty. She says, I feel that I do. And he's got some ring on page 401. It's a little ring with little diamonds in it. And you'll take this as a token from me. And he has a ring. Oh, I cannot wear a ring. And at that point I thought, thank gosh, she has decided not to keep the ring. She said, I cannot swear it. So wild a scheme. Please let me go home. On the next page, he's getting more erratic. News? Anybody married or engaged, born or dead? Inquired the farmer gaily. Tell it so, Tall. One would think from your looks and mysterious ways that it was something very dreadful. He's really encouraged, but we know that it's he's losing it. So on the next page, a stranger walks in, and of course it's Boldwood. Boldwood was among those, page 403, who did not notice that he was Troy. Come in, he repeated cheerfully, and drain a Christmas beaker with us, stranger. Troy began to laugh, a mechanical laugh. Boldwood recognized him now. So we know that all of these plot threads are coming together. Troy is back in the picture. What happens next, of course, is Boldwood says at the top of 404, Bathsheba, go with your husband. He knows he's lost. Troy stretched out his hand to pull her towards him when she quickly shrank back. This visible dread of him seemed to irritate Troy. He seized her arm and pulled it sharply. Well, that was the fatal flaw, because he grabs her arm and she squeals. And the scream had been heard but a few seconds when it was followed by a sudden, deafening rapport that echoed through the room. And it's as if it was inevitable. That Boldwood is standing next to his gun rack. He overreacts when Troy grabs her arm, but he came to her defense. And so all the plot threads are coming together. If we look in the next chapter, it's called The Aftershock. And over on 407, I'm sure you noticed that no one's doing anything about the current situation. So it's, of course, Bathsheba who takes charge. She tells Gabriel to ride to Casterbridge instantly for a surgeon. It is, I believe, useless, but go. Mr. Boldwood has shot my husband. Interesting language that she has taken the possessive. Page 409. The chorus, the townspeople are saying, the body had been undressed and properly laid out in grave clothes. Gracious heaven, this mere girl, she must have the nerve of a stoic. And yeah, she has that kind of interior strength. This I thought was interesting. So she's the heart of a wife merely. She has taken charge. She's taken him upstairs and laid him out. And then, typical Victorian, then as if that instant to prove that her fortitude had been more of will than spontaneity, she silently sank down them and was a shapeless heap of drapery on the floor. She faints. Typical Victorian. One of the critics said something like that she's very strong, and then typical. It's kind of like in B movies. If there's a woman running in the forest, she's wearing heels and will fall. It's just what happens. The next chapter, of course, the townspeople are talking again. It's past 3 months. The plot is essentially now complete. These somewhat pathetic evidences of mind, crazed with care and love, are the subject of discourse. They're talking about Boldwood, who has kind of lost it, which, of course, is going to then allow him to not be executed. There's a reference to it at the top of page 414. The execution had been fixed for 8 o'clock on Saturday morning, about a fortnight after the sentence was passed. But do ye think he really was out of his mind when he did it? I can't honestly say that I do. However, that we can talk of another time. Has there been any change in Mistress this afternoon? So, in fact, he's going to be acquitted, because Boldwood's going to be acquitted. At least he's going to be imprisoned rather than executed. And chapter 415. Yes, 'tis come. He's not to die. 'Tis confinement during Her Majesty's pleasure. That's Queen Victoria. At the next chapter on the top of page 416, Bathsheba revived with the spring. So the cycles again, the whole thing is very tidily enmeshed in the cycles of life. The utter prostration that had followed the low fever from which she had suffered diminished perceptibly when all uncertainty upon every subject had come to an end. I wrote COVID in the margin. She has a low fever, which she suffered for months. And then over on 417, there's that picture of her taking care of Fanny because she was her servant. But underneath this was now inscribed the new letters. In the same grave lie the remains of the aforesaid Francis Troy, who died December 24, 18 such and such, age 26. I thought that was interesting because to me he seemed older than that. But yes, here's where Bathsheba is doing the proper care for Fanny, but also empathizing with her. The fact, over on page 419, the fact is I'm thinking of leaving England, he says. Not yet, next spring. He just doesn't know how he fits in anymore. There is a reference to their friendship at the top of 420, such old friends as we are. And remember, she said, the next time I marry, it will be for far different reasons. And in part, it's going to be because they're friends. 3 weeks went on, and more evidence of his want of interest in her was forthcoming. Remember, this has happened a couple of times in this book, that Bathsheba gets a little cranky with the fact that Oak doesn't pay any attention to her. Of course, he's kind of mourning this, but she doesn't like that. Oak never came at all. On page 421, the next morning brought the culminating stroke. She had been expecting it long. It was a formal notice by letter from him that he should not renew his engagement with her for the following lay day. That's the next season for farming. She actually cried. So now she's beginning to realize that, in fact, Oak is maybe something that she should have an interest in. The bottom of page 422, it was very odd to those two persons who knew each other passing well that the mere circumstance of their meeting in a new place, in a new way, should make them so awkward and constrained. So it's the renewal. It's a renewal of their friendship. But now Oak had become the entertainer. Their lives seemed to be moved back again to the days when they were strangers. So they can't have renewed this relationship in Bathsheba's house, because then servant and mistress, that dynamic is still intact. So she goes to him. Of course, she's a bold person. And over on page 424, Gabriel looked her long in the face, but the firelight being faint, there was not much to be seen. Bathsheba, he said tenderly and in surprise, coming closer, if only I knew one thing, whether you would allow me to love you and win you and marry you after all. If only I knew that. But you will never know, she murmured. Why? She says, because you never ask. I thought that was funny. I was the first sweetheart that you ever had, and you were the first I ever had, and I shall not forget it. Now, Bathsheba, was ever anybody so provoking, he asked. So this is an interesting renewal of their relationship, because there's not any great momentous moment. And even in the last chapter, in the end, the pictures are of Bathsheba and Oakwood like they are pictures of them in the beginning, and yet now they are their more mature selves. They have developed a different kind of relationship. She doesn't want any kind of big old grand ceremony with everybody looking at her, because that's what people do in that town. She wants the most private, secret, plainest wedding that it is possible to have. And he mentions getting a license. That might be the plainest way to go about it, because you could either have a big church wedding or any kind of church wedding, or you can just get a license. I think it's the a system that we currently have, where you can have a civil ceremony and you just go to the courthouse and get hitched. But that's what she wanted. She doesn't want to be spoken about. It's subtle, it's plain, it suits them. Bathsheba lashed with a flushed cheek and whispered in Liddy's ear, although there was nobody present. Then Liddy stared and exclaimed, "Souls alive, what news? It makes my heart go quite bumpity-bump." And here we see that Bathsheba and Liddy are friends here. And she tells her a secret, and the secret is, of course, that they're going to get married. So at the top of page 431, here's long life and happiness to neighbor Oak and his comely bride. He refers to her at least twice as his wife, as though that is a very familiar phrase. "Faith," said Coggin in a critical tone, turning to his companion, the man have learnt to say my wife in a wonderful natural way, considering how very youthful he is in wedlock as yet. Hey, neighbors, all. I never heard a skillful old married feller of 20 years stand and pipe my wife in more used notes than he did." So they are observing the comfort between them. There's much affection. It isn't like the infatuation with Troy, in which it caused a shift in the dynamics, where he was condescending. Here they are suitably admirable of each other. It's not giddy. At the end of this, but since 'tis as 'tis, why, it might have been worse, and I feel my thanks accordingly. So, oh, got my book again. So, back in Cambridge, I have 138. I may have already read that. The proximity of love relationships. Oh, I already read that. In the novel draws attention to its conception. Well, I already read that, so that's good. Oh, another reference. 142. I hope you don't mind the pause. And concluding the couples in what they share is knowledge, shared work, shared knowledge, and shared language that, in Far from the Madding Crowd, confer its rightness upon the Bathsheba Oak marriage. Where difference, that's it. It is important, though, that Hardy's versions of gender and class are never displacements of one another. Whether in the simplicity of Fanny's choice, the false starts that Bathsheba's financial independence allows her, or half-made commitments, it is the interplay and contradiction between these two powerful social discourses that is the focus of narrative attention. In Hardy's fiction, the plot of romance, often seen as the plot of the private life, is profoundly social. So we have come to the end of this novel. I've been talking for an hour and a half. Can you imagine that? And I just have a few thoughts from Virginia Woolf. We have to give her credence because she is who she is. But as we consider the great structure of the Wessex novels, it seems irrelevant to fasten on little points. This character, that scene, the phrase of deep and poetic beauty, it is something larger that Hardy has bequeathed to us. Like every great novelist, he gives us not merely a world which we can liken to the world we know, but an attitude towards it, an atmosphere surrounding it, which is of far greater importance and lasts long after the world which the novelist portrays has vanished forever. Remember, he wanted to preserve this. This spirit, though it is in the scene, exists of the writer as well as in the art and language that he uses. The greater the writer, the more completely the different elements are fused into one. That is why the effect of a great novel is so commanding, so complete, and yet so extremely difficult to analyze in words. When we read the Wessex novels, we have to free ourselves from the cramp and pettiness imposed by life. Our imaginations have to expand and soar. Our humor has to laugh out. We have to drink deep of the beauty of the earth. But also, we have to enter the shade of a sorrowful and brooding spirit, which even in its saddest moods still bore itself with a grave uprightness, and never, even when most moved to anger, lost its simple tenderness for the sufferings of men and women. Thus it is no mere transcript of life at a certain time and place that Hardy has given us. It is a vision of the world and of man's lot as they revealed themselves to an astonishing imagination, a profound and poetic genius, a gentle and humane soul. It is for this, a gift of lasting and inexhaustible value, that we have to thank him today. So I think, I hope I've summarized this for you and touched on some of the really important elements of the novel. Maybe someday you can read some of the other ones or reread this one. The detail in here, when you read it a second time, jump out at you like you didn't notice them. That's all I have. Have a nice day. I'm going to post this soon, like today sometime, once I can figure out how to give myself a YouTube account. Don't know how to do that yet. Anyway, I will see you in the fall. If you have questions, you can post them the way you did this summer, and I will answer them this week. So thank you very much for listening. Goodbye. See you in the fall.